Are we alone in the cosmos? The question of if we are alone in the cosmos is perhaps the most important matter facing humanity. A conclusive answer would redefine the sciences, humanities, and even religion. I believe that to begin answering this question, we need to study the biological rhythms of life on our planet and how they are synchronized by the sun and our moon. I call this biological time. We begin our journey of discovery on the California beaches with the California grunion, which swim en masse onto the shores. They do this at the spring tides, which occur at the new and the full moons. The spring tides have the highest of the high and the lowest of the low tides. The female grunion swims first up onto the beach. She drops her eggs, and the male then fertilizes those eggs. They then catch the next highest of the high tide wave back out into the surf. This timing of the grunion couldn't have happened many millions in our past or in the future, as the moon is slowly moving away from the Earth, approximately 3.8 centimeters per year. So in the distant future or in the far past, the tides would have been different. There would have been a different duration between the new and the full moons, and when the grunion dropped their eggs and the juveniles were ready to go out to the surf. So the life history strategy of the grunion would have been different. They would have had to either grow faster, slower, or they might have become a variation within the grunion themselves. People around the world have timed their lives to animals such as the grunion. In this case, we have the Yami people of Taiwan. They're indigenous people that were before the Kuomintang, who came out of China, the so-called nationalists. And every year they have a flying fish festival, which is they go out in the middle of the night with their torches, and when they identify the flying fish, they take it back to the camp and they start their festival. And they time that flying fish festival 12 lunations or 12 new moons after the last time that the festival began. And if they don't find it after 12 lunations, they go out the next new moon and it's always there. And that flying fish ceremony puts in motion the calendar for hundreds of other fish and marine life that the Yami time their life to. So they believe, and then their tradition was carried on since time immemorial, that all the animals, or all these marine animals, are timed on the same solar clock, and they all move in synchrony with each other. We can travel across the Pacific to the state of Washington to meet the Tuolip people, confederated tribes just north of Seattle. The Tuolips time the first salmon, or rather the first salmon ceremony, to the appearance of the white pine butterfly. And in the springtime, they send out scouts to look for the white pine butterfly. And once the white pine butterfly is observed, they then look at the tides. And at the highest of the high tides, around the new and the full moons, they then set off their canoes into the surf to find the first salmon. And upon catching the first salmon, they bring it back to the ceremonial longhouse, where they have a feast, and then they put the remains of the salmon into the sea to invite other salmon to come, or the remainder of the population. Going south into Northern California, the Yurok Indians had a fish dam called the Keppel Fish Dam, which they timed 6 new moons after winter solstice, so it's a solar lunar timing, to identify when the first steelhead would come up. The steelhead are an anadromous rainbow trout with behavior very similar to the salmon. And they built this elaborate fish dam, took them 2 weeks, which was timed again to the sun, the earth, and the moon. And this was in their tradition. In the Columbia Basin, lower Columbia Basin near the borders of Oregon and Washington was there was once Salival Falls, which was a very early Native American place to catch or net salmon. It was flooded over in the 1940s or so to create a large dam system. But when it was in motion, when the people, Native Americans, were fishing at the Salival Falls, they timed the first salmon off of a myth about the coyote and the swallow sisters. And after the 4 days after the swallow sisters arrive, as indicated by the four swallows, they start fishing for the salmon, and that became their first salmon ceremony. But it wasn't timed just off the first swallows, but Chief Tommy Thompson, who was considered the last of the great chiefs, he also had a bird on top of a pole, and it was a sundial. And every night before the sun rose, he would look at the stars in the night sky to give him an indication of what was to come in terms of time. In the morning, he would watch the shadows. And he believed in his religion that he was listening to the great Almighty, who spoke to him through the shadow across the bird. As we move up the Columbia River, we meet the Nez Perce of Idaho of Chief Joseph Fane. The Nez Perce offers a more elaborate lunar calendar with all the details. If we go down to the red highlighted areas, we find the time the blueback salmon, and then the salmon reach the canyon streams to spawn, and the fall salmon run up the streams, and at the end, the season the fetus in the womb of deer. So the Nez Perce were not just coastal fishermen such as the Yami of Taiwan, but rather they relied on marine animals as well as terrestrial ones as well. The Thompson Indians, which would be north of the Nez Perce, timed their calendar off of the black-tailed deer. And they reset their lunar calendar with the rutting of the deer. And as they go down the moon, when the bucks shed their antlers and the does become lean, the moon, the deer drop their young, which would be timed back in the gestation period to when the deers rut. And then at the end, they have the first sockeye salmon and the silver salmon. So what we're seeing now with the Nez Perce and the Thompson Indians, we find both marine-derived as well as terrestrial animals. And that they believed, and in the tradition since time immemorial, was that these animals and plants had soul lunar behavior, and they timed their entire lives in their migratory behavior to them. Across the Pacific, in Siberia, the Chukchi timed their life of the caribou, or reindeer, as they would say. And it's the old buck moon, the cold otter, the calving moon, which is consistent with the dropping of the young for the Thompson deer, and the rubbing velvet antlers moon. So this is not just a North American tradition for large animals, but it goes across the Pacific as well, or an observation of people who lived among the animals. So the question is it possible for these large animals to have solar lunar behavior? Well, this was tested with the wildebeest in the Serengeti. There was a paper published in 1977 by Sinclair in Nature, and he back calculated he studied calculated or observed the dropping of the young, and then back calculated the gestation period, and he found that within a day or so from his calculations, it was expected to be a full moon when these animals mated. So it wasn't just a lunar calendar, where this is not just a lunar calendar, but rather a lunar calendar with specific times within the lunation, that being the full moon, when the mating would have started for the wildebeest. We can look at the same phenomena for salmon in Oregon and Washington. This one is coho fry, and we can see that during the full moon periods they actually slow down, and the dark moon periods they migrate. This is data that I worked with Oregon Fish and Wildlife on developing into graphs. The fish counts came from these fish traps, which are positioned just below a narrow area in the river where most of the juveniles will pass through. We find this upstream migration solar lunar behavior with winter steelhead, which would be similar to the steelhead that the Yurok time their Keppel fish dam to. You can notice that during the full moons we have the lowest points of migration. And this is behavior that continues on year after year. And if they're migrating upstream with this sort of lunar rhythm, one could also expect that there's a reason to it. And we can see the peak coho counts, our adult coho counts in this river called Lobster Creek on the coastal Oregon is all around the full moon. Now this was weekly data. If the fisher biologists had gone out on the new, the moon, the new, the full, and the half moons, we'd actually have a straight line going up at the full moon. So what this means, and ties back into the traditions of the Native Americans, is that the springtime staging the base of the salmon, which are the Tualaps, the neap tide migration through the estuaries, the dark moon migration of rivers such as was found with the Yurok with the steelhead, the full moon grouping around spawning areas as the Lobster Creek coho, and they'd be spawning just after the full moon. There's a continuum, so that one event leads to the other, in the same way that the Yami in Taiwan found the occurrence of one species arriving or their events happening consecutively in a continuum. Why would the fish have this behavior? Well, we can follow down the food chain. This is actually a trout, but we can go down to, on one side we find mayfly nymphs, on the other side freshwater shrimp. In the river environment, Norm Anderson, aquatic entomologist at Oregon State, had a paper published in Nature in '66. And he showed that during the dark of the moon, there's tremendous migration of invertebrates or insects in the rivers. And around the full moon, there was very little migration. So the fish are timing their life to in the freshwater environment to the movement of these invertebrates, and vice versa. The invertebrates are capturing the best time to migrate when the fish can least likely see them. In the marine environment, in lakes, we also have a so-called diel vertical migration, where you have animals moving up and down in the food chain, or up and down from the surface to deeper depths. It's the same type of behavior. And aquatic limnologists who study Daphne and zooplankton in the lakes, they in their practices, best practices, they will go out to look for the animals on the dark of the moon so that they have consistency from one month to the next in their counts. Well, there's a solar lunar problem with all this. It all sounds simple. You go out and look at the white pine butterfly and the other animals as the sentinel species, but it's a little more complicated than that. There are 365 plus days in the solar year and 29.5 days in the lunar cycle of light. 12 times 29.5 is 11 days short. So hypothetically, if the salmon migration was in the new moon of January 12th one year, it would January 1st the next year. Hypothetically. But it can't always work that way, because they'd be moving back in time, and the salmon that migrate up in January are not going to keep moving back in time to August or earlier in the previous year. So the salmon have, and the steelhead and these other animals have a time of the year that they can resynchronize their behavior. And most of the Native Americans actually never figure that out. What they did figure out is that if they went and looked for a sentinel species such as the white pine butterfly with the Tualaps, you could then time off the salmon, or the Columbia Basin tribes were using the swallows to time the salmon in the lower river as well. And we can see all these different traditions, and the Tualap, the white pine butterfly, the Yami timed off the flying fish for their entire calendar. The Yurok used a solar lunar calendar. I don't have evidence that they used other species, but I would bet that they did. The Thompson used the white-tailed deer. The Chukchi calendar was entirely about the reindeer or caribou, and the Columbia-based Indians, it was the sun, the moon, the stars, as well as the migration of the swallows preceding the first salmon. The question then becomes, does the moon have an effect on us? We've all heard the stories that there's people go crazy during a full moon night, and all the work that's been done on that indicates that, or the scientific work, that if you were crazy during a full moon night, you were crazy during the day, and the full moon itself was keeping you awake. But we do have a unique clock, or as females in our species have a unique clock that's timed to the moon. The women's menstrual cycle is 28 days average, which is timed uniquely to the moon itself. And going back to our, we talked about the Grunion. Had the moon been further or closer to the Earth, the Grunion cycle would have been off, but that would have been the same thing for us as Homo sapiens. At some time in the distant past, the female's menstrual cycle was not timed to that of the moon, and it will not be in the future. And I believe that there was this unique time within Homo sapiens that the females were in fact timed to the moon, and thereby it became an actual clock. And we have to consider that if we didn't emerge in that time and have that cognitive ability to connect the sun, always the moon, and the Earth, we might have not made the great leap forward out of the trees. And there's also another point to consider, is that menstrual cycles within animals are actually quite rare. It's primates, bats, and elephant shrew, as far as we know. And that's among over 1 million species of animals. We fundamentally have about 20 or 25. So it's very rare on this planet at this time. Other animals come into heat or season, such as the horse. And horses have a 336-day or 11.5 lunation gestation period. And they will foal or drop their young in April, which then sets them in motion that they could become pregnant a week or two afterwards, and create a calendar in itself. And of course, we can find such a calendar among the Yakut, the people of Siberia, where one of the lunations is the foal he catches, which is in April. And this calendar was retrieved by Johansen, an anthropologist. How far back in time does this go? Well, we find it among Native Americans as well as people in Siberia. People in Siberia had originally come over through the Beringia between 25 and 15,000 years ago. So it's not too extreme to think that it happened much earlier. And we can look at this rutting red deer, or Megaloceros, in the Lascaux Cave of France from 17,000 years ago. And we can see the animal is blowing out steam, perhaps in the morning. Its neck is stretched and is identical to this actual red deer. And under the Megaloceros at Lascaux, we can see 13 dots that lead to a box. And I would argue that that box indicates a full moon, and they're counting from the first observed new moon to the full moon, which in fact would have been the calendar. Of course, that ties back into the rutting of the Serengeti wildebeest, which was at the full moon per the data of Sinclair, as published in Nature. So we've taken this great journey of discovery from the California beaches of the Grunion to the Lascaux Cave 17,000 years ago. But how did we make this great leap forward to conscious timekeeping? Well, if we go back to the Yami, it was probably at the beach, and the distant ancestor of ours, maybe the common ancestor with the chimpanzee, was a seashore gatherer or scavenger. And the female within the species, or many females over maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, because it happened probably many times, they made that connection between the tides, their body, and the moon, and that enabled them to be more efficient gatherers, and ultimately allowed them to walk off of the beach and find other animals and plants, which set them on a great migration over time, over the many millions of years that followed. So were there others who made this great leap forward? Most likely for the moon, because I believe that this was a fairly early stage in the development of humanity. And so Neanderthals and Habilis and others probably had the same ability. But what we probably didn't have is the coordination with the sun and the stars, which enabled much greater migrations and more better timekeeping. So instead of following the herds, one could actually predict when the herds would be there. At this point, we can step back and consider the original question of, are we alone in the cosmos? In scientific circles, we use the Drake equation, a formula for predicting interstellar communicating alien life, as formulated by Frank Drake of SETI. I believe that the Drake equation needs some reconsideration, and specifically, Fi, the fraction of those planets with life that develop intelligent life, and Fc, the fraction of those planets with intelligent life that develop interstellar communication. I believe it's quite a leap forward between those two that can't be solved with a simple mathematical equation. The counter to the Drake equation is, well, if we have all these aliens out there, then why don't we see them? And there's many reasons for that as described. If we go down to the bottom right, life is extremely rare. And I believe that is the crux of it all. It's not that just life is extremely rare, but life that is intelligent in the way that we are, conceiving, that we can look back and forth to see the past and calculate the future, is very rare. So what would it take? Well, a blue planet with an Earth, Sun, and Moon, and perhaps a moon that has another body, solar body, that allows for timekeeping. Animals with a menstrual-like cycle, which is very rare on this planet, and the menstrual cycle would be in sync with the moon or the other astral body, which again is highly rare, not just within our planet, but within the time of our planet from its beginning. An animal biologically gauging time with the moon and another lunar time animal to reinforce the value. So you just can't have a chimpanzee which learns how to get in sync with the lunar tides, but rather they would also need to be able to figure out that the crabs or the grunion or whatever species are tied to specific tides, which be calculated through the biological rhythm of the animal. And expanding the lunar recognition to other animals. So you can't just be successful by eating grunion and crabs on the beach. You would also need to get off the beach and find the wildebeest and being in time and sync with their own cycles. And then learn to reset the moon to the sun and the stars. So if you're traveling around the Serengeti, following the wildebeest, as the Chukchi do with the reindeer, you're fairly limited. To be successful, you'd need to be able to reset your lunar calendar on the fly to be able to go to another area where you could capitalize on other species. So are we alone in the cosmos? The big question. Well, my perspective is that we don't know, but what are the chances given this perspective? Unless there's another way that we can have intelligent timekeeping life that ultimately has interstellar communicating abilities. It is very rare because it's almost in a flash on this planet, in a moment in time, and among species that are quite rare in itself, meaning us. In the words of the sage Billy Joel, you may be right, I may be crazy, but but it just may be a lunatic you're looking for. A lot of my work can be found on beforeorion.com and using the same language for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Tumblr, Pinterest. And some of this work is in my book Before Orion, Finding the Face of the Hero. And please visit to ask questions and give comments. Thank you.